Inside America's Boardrooms, the informational show for board members and corporate secretaries. Brought to you with Knowledge Partners, NASDAQ, the Center for Audit Quality, and PwC. Along with content contributors Equilar, Meridian Compensation Partners, Wilson Sonsini Goodrich and Rosati, R.R. Donnelly, and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.
Welcome to this edition of Inside America's Boardrooms. I'm TK Kerstetter, the CEO of Boardroom Resources and your host for today's show. We're going to talk about our board disclosures, a good solution for investors. And joining me to discuss this and some other topics is Doug Chia, who is the Executive Director of the Conference Board Governance Center. Welcome, Doug.
Thank you, TK.
So, first of all, let's talk a little bit about your transition. You
Sure.
had years at Johnson & Johnson in the Corporate Secretary's office. You've also been very active in the Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals group. I believe you were chairman of that group.
Yes.
So, here you come from the confines of well-respected Johnson & Johnson, and you go over to the Governance Center at the Conference Board. Was there anything that sort of evolved out of all that previous experience that when you went over and had the Conference Board as a tool that you wanted to make sure that you covered?
Yeah, I think in my experience at J&J and just in general in the governance community, one thing that I noticed where I thought the Conference Board could really add some value to the marketplace is to look into what is the actual job description of a board member. There's a lot of debate around appointing people to the board, who should have the right to appoint people to the board, proxy access, but my question is, well, if we can't even agree on what the job description is, then why are we talking about appointments? Until there's a common understanding of what that is supposed to be, it's going to be very difficult for people to agree on, who gets to select board members and what the qualifications actually are. I've heard a range of explanations and expectations of board members. You have the board member who comes in and wants to talk about, how much salt should be on the bread and how much bread should be served. To the board members who really view themselves as, more oversight, deferential to management, not getting it, not really chiming in on the day-to-day. You also have board members who say, well, talking directly to investors, that's really not part of my job. But investors would say, no, of course it's part of your job. We elected you. So, with such a large range of opinions on what a board member is actually supposed to do, to me it seems like we need to have some kind of common principles. It's the definition is not going to be the same for every single, or it's not going to apply to every single company. You're going to have different companies at different stages, or large companies versus small companies that probably need different types of directors, but at least there needs to be some common understanding around what the expectations of those people are before you actually start to evaluate the performance.
Well, I can tell you that the institutional shareholders care about board composition.
Yes.
We launched the Investors Board Performance Review a couple weeks ago and had in some of the world's largest investors. And I was surprised at how much they talked about composition.
Yeah.
And the other thing they talked a lot about was they were frustrated, and this won't surprise you, they were frustrated that they couldn't see behind the boardroom doors to see actually how people operated.
Yeah.
And one of the things I wanted to ask you with all your experience is that frustration has seemed to come out in the form of disclosure requests.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
And all of a sudden we're in a position that they want disclosures on sort of everything that's happening, sustainability, on strategy, which is always difficult,
Yeah.
on risk. On every piece of the business, they want disclosures.
Sure.
I think sort of you and I know that those disclosures aren't really the value, I think, that they're drummed up to be. They typically end up being drafted, and you can either confirm or deny this,
Yeah.
but they typically either get drafted by an attorney,
Yeah.
somewhat boilerplate. But when you look at the disclosures
Yeah.
and what's happening, sort of sum up your feeling about all this. And is there a solution between what they would like to look at by getting in the boardroom and these disclosures?
Yeah, I understand the frustration. As a corporate secretary, I'm sitting in the boardroom. I get to see how the board functions, and I have my own evaluation of how well that's going, how effective they're being, and in particular board members. Who are the really good board members, and you'd probably be surprised in terms of who are the real great ones versus who are the ones that could use some work. So obviously, one way to try to get a peek into there without having cameras in the boardroom is disclosure. But as we know, disclosure has, its limits. When people said, okay, we want more disclosure about board members, we want you to describe why a particular board member was selected and is the right person for our board, that's going to reveal something or give you some insight. I was pretty blunt and told people, I think you got to lower your expectations on that, because that language, it's going to be written by people like me, and people like me worry about things like liability, and also there's politics involved in how you write it, and so. Not surprisingly, you saw a lot of disclosures about why this particular board member is unique and is exactly the right person for this spot on the board. And if that is really going to help you, I don't, my personal take was it's going to be additional disclosure that weighs down the larger proxy statement. I don't know how useful and effective it is. It's, I've heard other investors say, well, we want a cover letter written directly by the independent chair or the lead director talking about governance. It's the same thing.
You're still going to write it, right?
They're not going to a cabin in the woods over the weekend to write this thing, and with no editing. And also, what is it going to tell you that the rest of the proxy statement doesn't already tell you? So, I know this is a cynical view, but I do think that's where the engagement really is kind of the better solution. To actually sit down with somebody and size them up in terms of, okay, is this person, intelligent, articulate? Do they understand the issues and what their role is? Again, do we have a common understanding of what the board member's role is? Now, I think that's probably the closest you're going to get to being able to size up a board member. I think it's much more effective than just disclosure or, written on a piece of paper. The problem is it's hard to, how does every investor have a shot at that? The answer is it's impossible. So in a lot of ways, what we're seeing now is the largest investors get that kind of access, and really the smaller investors are relying on the larger investors to do the due diligence for them on these directors, which is similar to what happens in underwritten deals or M&A, etc. So it's I think that's the closest thing, but it's we're not there yet. Most companies, I don't think, are actively doing this, and a lot of investors are not interested in that either. And then there's the bandwidth issue in terms of do investors and companies have the bandwidth to do all of this? It really adds cost to the system when investors are really trying to minimize the costs that get passed on to their ultimate beneficiaries.
Well, I certainly would agree on the shareholder engagement gives you a much better look inside at least the minds of some of the directors, and
Yeah.
do they get it? It looks like we have about 3 minutes left, Doug,
Sure.
and I really want to talk about this publication that you guys put out recently.
Yeah.
It was titled, "Is Short-Term Behavior Jeopardizing the Future Prosperity of Business?" Now, this short-termism discussion has been going on for a long time,
Yeah.
and we never seem to get very far with it. So talk a little bit about the motivation for doing this study and what you hope comes out of it.
Yeah, obviously, this concept has been around for a while. It's not going away anytime soon. I think for us, what we try to do is have empirical evidence that shows, yes, this is a phenomenon. It's not just anecdotal evidence. Just anecdotally, people are saying, oh, people are focusing on the short term over the long term. And what we're trying to do is really get people to have a real discussion about what are the drivers and what are the solutions. I think up until now, there's been a lot of finger pointing. Management says, well, it's the sell side analysts that are forcing us to meet their quarterly expectations. The hedge funds will say, well, it's the portfolio managers are asking us to squeeze more, more alpha. The management says, well, the investors say management's listening too much to the sell side analysts and not listening enough to the actual investors. And management's got a dilemma in terms of it is hard to forecast and create incentives around long-term performance when the economic environment is so challenging and rapidly changing for things that management really can't control.
So is there a place that our audience can view a copy of this? Or?
Yeah, I think on our website on conferenceboard.org/governance, you can access a copy. We plan to have discussions around the country. We convene small groups of people to come talk about this, and what I'm hoping is that people are willing to put everything on the table and say, okay, look, we are all part of the problem in some way. And so we all have to be part of the solution and kind of look inwards in terms of, all right, what are our practices in terms of how we incentivize our people, what kind of policies we set, and how can we make adjustments? The management, the investors, board members, sell side, everyone has to look at their own behaviors and be honest with themselves in terms of, yeah, maybe there are some concepts that were seen as sacrosanct before that we have to look at again. Things like dual class stock, loyalty shares, tenure shares, these types of things that are seen as anathema to some people. Maybe it is time to revisit that and examine what other tools can we be using, at least on an experimental basis by some companies, to see if it makes a difference. Getting away from quarterly earnings, we can see management manages to the quarterly earnings. Our paper shows that there's really no doubt about it. And that's unhealthy. If you told management, we want you to, we have a daily number that we want you to hit, I'm pretty sure that management will find a way to hit that daily number within, a penny or two. It's not just, this doesn't happen by magic. And so we really need to look at, this system that we've created, which some people say, well, the system won't allow that. We're just too entrenched at this point. I think that's essentially giving up and just saying, the status quo is what it is. So,
well, Doug, the conference board is fortunate to have somebody with your background,
Thank
and
you.
I think it's going to be exciting to see, how you can add to the value of making boards more effective, and we sort of welcome you into the fold, in that sense. And I want to thank you for taking the time to join us today.
TK, thanks for having me.
Sure. And that will conclude this edition of Inside America's Boardrooms. We hope you enjoyed the show. We'll be back again next week when we take a look at another critical topic that'll help you be a better board member or committee member. So we'll see you then.
Join us again next week for Inside America's Boardrooms. Brought to you with Knowledge Partners, NASDAQ, the Center for Audit Quality, and PwC. Along with content contributors Equilar, Meridian Compensation Partners, Wilson Sonsini Goodrich and Rosati, R.R. Donnelly, and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.